Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast. I'm Scot, and I'm inviting you to join me as I take a lonely stroll, with nothing but the light of the moon, and well, this computer monitor, I suppose, as I make my way down Nightmare Alley. Now, while the originally intended focus of this little podcast was going to be the Guillermo Del Toro film that came out December of 2021, I will also be discussing the 1947 film by the same name, and how both films are adaptations of the 1946 novel by William Lindsay Gresham. And that note leads me to my first digression, or tangent, or whatever one might call it, and that's what really constitutes a true remake. Now, for the first few decades of my movie-going and TV-watching life, the concept of a remake was fairly common. It was also commonly seen as a negative. But then in recent years, we started hearing terms like reboots. And then, of course, you also then would get reimagining. Which, while I would initially scoff at such a term, it actually would be a better way to refer to some famous remakes, when not simply the time period, but the overall setting and the world of the story is completely changed. For example, one could call The Magnificent Seven a remake of The Seven Samurai, but it's really more of a reimagining. A reboot feels more like when you're looking to restart a film or TV franchise all over again. So Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight films, they weren't remakes of the Batman films by Burton and Schumacher, any more than those films were remakes of the Adam West Batman film from the 60s, or the Batman serials from the 1940s. But they most certainly constitute a reboot of the Batman franchise. But my double standard issue when you're using the term remake is when you're talking about two or more productions that themselves are adapted from something else. Usually a book, although it could also be something such as a play. Now, there may be those film fans who instinctively had a preconceived notion against, say, this new Del Toro version of Nightmare Alley, and one of their ways of being negative was branding it a remake. But when you start using those rules, the versions that we know and love of any number of films start to come into question. Films like The Wizard of Oz or The Maltese Falcon, iconic films, are actually both remakes. They both were not the first filmed versions of those books. Now, is Mel Gibson's Hamlet a remake of Laurence Olivier's from the 1940s? Wait, why did I go with Gibson? Let's make that Kenneth Branagh's version of Hamlet. Or maybe Ethan Hawke's version of Hamlet. Actually, Ethan Hawke's version of Hamlet is more a reimagining. But you see what I mean. They're all adaptations of Hamlet. Or if we're going to go the book route, I'll take one of my old favorites, Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, also known as 10 Little Indians and even 10 Little, well, let's forget that title. Anyway, there have been 4 legitimate versions of that fantastic book. Not to mention who knows how many stories and films have cribbed, if not completely ripped off that story. But does one think every version that came after the René Clair directed version from the 1940s is a remake? I don't think they do. The point is they're all adaptations of the same work, and few, if any, would call any one version a remake of the other. And yet we still do. It seems like we pick and choose when we're going to use that term. And I will confess I am as guilty as anyone of this. I mean, just a couple years ago, I remember seeing the Netflix trailer for a new version of Rebecca. And I almost instantly hated it. How dare they touch a Hitchcock classic? And then what do? They dress it up to look like some subpar Downton Abbey wannabe or something. But in all honesty, that was a ridiculous notion by me. I mean, Rebecca was a book by Daphne du Maurier first. The Netflix production is simply a new adaptation. And then, also to be super honest, the 1940 film Rebecca It's not even in my top 10 Hitchcock films. I don't even think it's in my top 15 for that matter. Don't worry, I'm not about to sit here and tick off just how many Hitchcock movies would place above Rebecca. I'm just using that as an example of how guilty I am of the very same thing. We all do it. So while I won't say anyone is out and out wrong when they refer to this new movie, the 2021 version of Nightmare Alley, as a remake, but in all honesty, it's just another adaptation of the same novel. In some ways, it's a more faithful adaptation of that novel, if anything. Now, a lot of that faithfulness, or lack thereof in the earlier version, could be attributable to the times that you lived in then and now. I mean, there were simply matters you might be able to get away with in a book, but you could never put on a film back in the 1940s. That's for damn sure. So, since I'm talking about the book, let me flip through a page or two about that book. Kind of as the background behind the book might actually be more racy and really ultimately more tragic than the story itself. And hopefully if you've seen at least one, if not both versions of this movie, that's like, wow, more tragic than that? Yep. So let me take a moment to fill my glass, get a little drink on here. So just hold on there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the book was written by William Lindsay Gresham. The man was born in Baltimore, grew up in Brooklyn, and he later lived in Greenwich Village, getting by as a folk singer there. Now, after volunteering as a medic during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, turns out his friendship with a former carny inspired him to write a nonfiction book called Monster Midway, and of course, the novel Nightmare Alley, which was completed years later. Now, along the way, he also suffered through a suicide attempt as well as a stay in a tuberculosis ward, but he eventually married a poet, Joy Davidman, and had 2 sons with her. Now, later, when he sold the rights to his book, he got about as big a payday as one could imagine back then, which led to him making a massive home purchase in a little sparsely populated hamlet in New York. But success also led to infidelity, and a lot of it, and drinking, and a lot of that, and sadly, even occasional bouts of really eruptive violence between him and his wife. Now, he might have considered himself a Christian man, but his wife, Davidman, she was essentially a Jewish atheist, which, in my mind, means you're a non-practicing Jew. I can relate. There's a reason I'm mentioning that, because this is where it starts to get a little bit more weird. Turns out she, the wife, got really into the works of C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia writer. And as readers of those books might attest, they are steeped deeply in Christian symbiology and metaphor. It's really hard to miss at some points. And it was by reading those books and her own, fandom that led to her converting to Christianity. Meanwhile, Gresham, he found himself drawn to, here it comes, Dianetics. Yep, the infamous book by L. Ron Hubbard, and we all know where that book led to. Now, all of this is happening while their money struggles are starting to mount. Yeah, he had the big payday from Nightmare Alley, but he really didn't have much success after that. Nothing in the chamber that was going to match the success of that book. And at one point, over the next few years, Joy, the wife, she fell ill. So she decides to go to London to meet C.S. Lewis. Because naturally, she's become pen pals with him. And in the meantime, she invites her cousin, Renee Rodriguez, to stay with William Lindsay in her absence. Apparently, it turns out Renee was also in an abusive marriage with 2 kids as well. So they had that in common. So what ends up happening? Joy and C.S. Lewis become lovers, while William and Renee are also in an adulterous affair of their own. And then later, Joy returns home, and then you get this really weird period of time where everybody's cheating on each other but living under the same roof, because I said those serious financial woes people couldn't go and find a new house or apartment on their own. Until, of course, Joy does leave, and she sells the house to help pay off the IRS because the financial troubles were tax issues and so on. And she marries C.S. Lewis. Actually, as an additional tangent on top of this, her relationship with C.S. Lewis is actually at the heart of Shadowlands. That's that production that's been filmed twice and was a stage play in between those two productions. All that happens, and then sadly, several years later, she dies of cancer, and she's only 45. Meanwhile, back to William Lindsay, after he himself marries Renee. For a little while there, he seems to get his act together. He joins Alcoholics Anonymous. He renounces Scientology. He gets back to writing. He even writes a book about Houdini. But sadly, a couple years after his ex-wife passes away, Gresham's own health takes a nosedive. He actually starts to go blind, and he gets diagnosed with tongue cancer, of all things. It's pretty horrible. What he ends up doing, he checks into the same hotel in New York City. The same hotel, I believe even the same room, where he spent many nights writing Nightmare Alley. And it's there he takes an overdose of sleeping pills, and he's dead at 53. 53. And if worse, there's not even much of an epilogue here because there was little or no fanfare or notice about it anywhere other than being referenced in a bridge column in one New York paper. So, like I said, the story of Nightmare Alley is certainly a tragedy, and the life behind the creation, or the creator, I should say, is at best or worst equally tragic. Now, I will be bringing up the original novel here and there just to point out changes that were made in either film, and either saying why or wondering why. And yes, I did say both films. Now, I'm not going to make separate chapters in the segment breakdown here for the two films. I mean, obviously the main objective and focus of this podcast will be the 2021 version, but I do want, maybe even need, to introduce the concepts and thinking behind the 1947 take on Nightmare Alley. And after a few minutes, I will be bringing it up throughout my monologuing about the Del Toro version. So what does all that mean? It means that there is no need for you to skip ahead. Trust me, it's just another attraction as we cruise through this Carnival of Souls. Ooh, Carnival of Souls, that's a really good movie too. But once again, I digress. So let's just chill out for a minute or two with not a minute or two, for a few seconds with some music while I sip this not so neat bourbon. Now, the 1947 adaptation of Nightmare Alley is at the very least a cult noir classic, and I'd say that might pigeonhole it a bit more than it deserves. I mean, first off, you have a film that is headlined by Tyrone Power and Joan Blondell. This was a movie Tyrone Power lobbied the studio to snag as he really wanted to escape, well, I mentioned pigeonholing, so the pigeonholing he felt. What's the phrase that we use all the time? Can't think of it off the top of my head. Wow. But he felt he had been pigeonholed, and that was starting to beleaguer him. He was only seen as a swashbuckler or your basic romantic lead. Typecasting. That's the word I was looking for. Typecasting. Jesus. Anyway, he reteamed with director Edmund Goulding, with whom he had worked the year before on The Razor's Edge, which actually could also be seen as the start of Tyrone Power trying to flex certain acting muscles that maybe had been dormant before that. Now, Joan Blondell, on the other hand, she was a massive female star of the 1930s. But as the mid-1940s hit, she had also hit her own 40s. And in Hollywood of this era especially, that typically meant you were going to be getting the mom or maybe even grandma roles, if any. Honestly, it was probably the advent of TV that saved many careers, as they were kept on life support with radio dramas otherwise. But Blondell's role in Nightmare Alley, it was really one of her last significant silver screen roles outside of some smaller supporting parts over a decade later. Otherwise, it was just a ton of 50s, 60s, and 70s TV for Miss Blondell. I mean, she did have that little part in Grease, there was that, but other than that, that's pretty much where her career unfolded for the next several decades. Now, I don't want to go too far down the road discussing the 1947 film, although like I said, I will be bringing it up a number of times as I contrast it with the Del Toro version. Now, as I did mention earlier, you could say the original movie was hamstrung by the times. Most studios were unwilling to go quite as dark as the creators would have liked. Hey, this is the kind of thing, it even happened to Hitchcock. He couldn't get the ending he wanted for Suspicion due to such studio interference, which is what led to him working out a deal that made most, if not all, of his subsequent films studio-proof. Although he would still have casting issues, but that's a tangent for yet another podcast. Or, remember I mentioned the 1940s version of And Then There Were None? Well, there was one pretty serious change, and that was to the ending, which is far darker in the original book, but the studio said, no, we can't do that. And it appears that might have also been the case with the first version, film version of Nightmare Alley. And while the 1947 version is a splendid little piece of film noir, maybe due to this being Power's first step into such material, maybe it was the studio, the writers, the director, maybe all of it. It gets a little leery about how much of a heel they want the main character, who is Stanton Carlyle. How much of a heel do they want him to be? Now, I understand that there's a consistent fear with studios about the likability of a film protagonist, or protagonists. This has always been the case. I mean, it has been thinking like that has led to things like, you know what? Actually led to the casting of people like Fred McMurray in Double Indemnity. That actually worked out pretty well. But you've also had other examples where not so much. It's both a help and a hindrance to both versions of this specific story. Do they go too far one way in 1947 and maybe too much in the other direction in 2021? Possibly. So let's take a look at the major differences here and how they might influence opinions of the Del Toro version of the film for both good and bad, depending on your tastes and patience. Now, the Del Toro version of the story, it's a good half hour to 35 minutes longer. Most of that length can be attributed to a massive deepening of character development and backstories, not just our mysterious lead, Stan Carlyle, but several members of the carnival, as well as Dr. Lilith Baker, Ezra Grindle, in the second half of the story. The opening of Del Toro's vision, roughly the first 15 minutes or so, you may notice Stan Carlyle doesn't even speak a word. Quite and incredibly rare for most any film. Though it does make me think of one. We see visions of death. We see visions of fire, of burial, of escape, preceding his arrival one night at the carnival. He shows up as both a drifter and a grifter. And after viewing the grotesque sideshow of the carnival's resident feral geek being fed a live chicken, he eventually does get a job there, earning his mattress to sleep on while doing odd jobs here and there, before working up to being the barker and assistant for the troop's mystic act with Madame Zena. You can say Madame Zena, you can say Mademoiselle Zena, whatever. You have all that build up to that point, takes, let's say, about 20 minutes. The 1947 film, yeah, we do see him watching a bit of the geek's treatment, which incidentally, of course, the audience, meaning us, we can't see it at all. It's pretty much off screen. But he's already working for the carnival at this point. He's already working with Xena and her alky husband, Pete. Now, I'll be honest, I do love when a movie can cut to the chase. Jumpstart that story sooner than later, I'm impressed as hell. But here, I really and truly think the background, specifically with Xena and especially Pete, is so very important. And it makes the genesis of Stan's character and his abilities make so much more sense. That even if it might try some people's patience, and by the way, if you have issues with the first 20 minutes of this movie, hey, you know what? Good luck with There Will Be Blood or The Master, because I did think of how many Paul Thomas Anderson films are like that. That he will take his time to build a foundation for his lead character to stand upon, especially when that lead character might not be the most terribly likable person in the world, to say the least. And before any of you can react to that, and I can imagine a couple of you might, I am not putting Cooper on the same plane of method acting madness and brilliance as either Daniel Day-Lewis or Joaquin Phoenix, so calm down. But back to those supporting characters and why I think it's so important. The Pete character, for example. He is so marvelously played by the always dependable, at worst, David Strathairn. I think that's a pivotal choice Del Toro makes here. The character is minimized in both the original book. There it's really more about Mademoiselle Zena than the pair of them. And the 1947 film, where when we do encounter the Pete character, he's typically borderline drunk or alternating between being testy or maybe at least on one occasion waxing rhapsodic about his golden days of performing. He actually has some lines that we hear Stan repeat towards the end of the movie, as if that gave them more weight. I guess they do. But as a result, it seems that the Tyrone Power version of Stan picks up on how to be a proper mentalist simply by thinking, looks easy enough to me, I can do that. Whereas in the 2021 movie, you can see the building blocks of how Stan becomes the great Stanton through his time at the carnival. I mean, just take a look at how much more convincing and ingenious Stan's manipulation of the marshal that crashes the carnival looking to lock people up is. I mean, it's a masterful display of observation and manipulation and really just how a mentalist works. It's far less so in the 1947 film. And unlike other matters, that wasn't an issue to worry about worrying about being too darkly violent or too sexual. It's simply just not as well conceived or executed. Now, both films have a little odd hitch in Stan's relationship with the women of the carnival. Zena and Molly, specifically. Molly, the girl who rides the lightning with her act involving coursing electric currents. In a way, by having to avoid any sort of sexual liaison in the earlier film, it's actually done a little cleaner. Unless one chooses to read more into a single kiss. We know that many times in older movies, due to certain rules, regulations, standards, practices, and whatnot, you had to read into things like, oh, that's a wink and a nod that something else is going to happen. Or usually it was matters of sex or sexuality. But here's the confusing part. In the 1947 film, that the 2021 film handles far better, and that's Molly. We learn that Bruno, the strongman of the carnival, as well as this additional character, the Major, who is a man of, shall we say, diminutive size, who works there, they look out for Molly. That promises were made with her now deceased father, and as such, Bruno sees Molly as sort of like his surrogate daughter. Now, the Bruno of the 1947 film plays it more as your prototypical jealous lover, even though there is nothing romantic or physical between him and Molly. He just doesn't want anybody else to be near her. In both versions, Stan makes it clear that he's truly only interested in Molly, and that he's really just kind of playing Xena to get that code book that could lead to a successful mentalist act far away from the sawdust, the freaks, and the rubes. Now, in the 2021 version, he wants to leave with Molly. It's pretty logical. But in the 1947 version, his original plan is actually to leave with Molly and Xena. And that plan only goes awry after Xena's tarot card reading. Oh, by the way, Blondell pronouncing the word as tarot, which may be considered legitimate by some, but really not the way most people would say it. I don't know. It kind of made me laugh for some reason. And I'm not one who tends to laugh at older movies going, oh, isn't that precious that they said it that way or something. But someone should have told her how to pronounce the goddamn word. Anyway, the characters like Bruno and even eventually Xena, they're a little bit more on the two-dimensional side in comparison. It's really hard to feel for either of them in the 1940s film. Maybe when Pete dies a little bit, but not much more than that, as far as Xena's concerned. And then there's this whole business of forcing a shotgun wedding between Molly and Stan, which just plays as being outright bizarre. She's not pregnant, for God's sake. I mean, it's funny because there is specifically a scene in the 2021 version that lets us know that Stan is going to be Molly's first, I don't think there's anything like that or a hint of that in the 1947 version outside of that forced wedding. But then again, that just simply may be indicative of the times rather than anything else. It presents the way, it just presents the way that they leave the carnival in very different ways. So on that entire matter, I would have to give the point to the 2021 version. Now, there is also the matter of Pete's death. I just made a reference to it a moment ago. In the 2021 version, one can foresee this event with when Defoe's Clem points out the two different crates of alcohol, which one is essentially, poison. It's basically Chekhov's gun. You just know that's going to come into play at some point, and you can pretty much already guess who's got the drinking issue and who's going to get the wrong bottle. The question is about that death. Was it truly accidental or not? Does Stan even really know himself, for that matter? I don't think it's as ambiguous in the 1947 version. The bottle that Stan meant to give Pete was the bottle he had gotten for himself. Now, how he mistakenly switches the bottle afterwards kind of does feel like a bit of a stretch, but never do I believe we are meant to think he intended it. Bottle, bottle, bottle. All this talk of bottles has me thirsty, so hold the line, please. As we leave the first half of both films, the carnival half, one can debate which Stan Carlisle is more likable or relatable. Which Stan do you want to spend more time with for like another hour and change? Now here's the thing. Now, I actually think Cooper's Stan is more relatable and borderline likable even than Powers', only as we see how he learns and evolves over the course of that hour. Whereas the Tyrone Power character that leaves the carnival, is he really much different than the guy we met in the opening minutes? Outside of maybe that one moment of how he sweet talks to Marshall, I don't really see a difference. However, I don't mean that as too harsh a criticism, because the Tyrone Power Stan, he's still your semi-prototypical noir leading dude. Kind of rough around the edges, but not really a bad guy quite as of yet. Just ambitious. Give him a sec. Now, while we can already see the inkling of Cooper's transformation in those visions of what happened before his arrival, haunt him and trouble us. So, maybe we might pick Tyrone Power to hang out with a little while longer rather than Bradley Cooper. Now, by the time we pick up with each one as the Great Stanton, I don't believe we actually ever hear how much time has passed in the 1940s version, but in the 2021 film, we do know it's 2 years later. And here is where the 2021 film first follows the 1947 film more than the book, then kind of doubles back and adheres more to the original printed word. Now, in the book, after being a successful act for a while, Stan actually gets bored, and he reinvents himself as some sort of spiritualistic preacher who does seances and such. His life of living a lie leads him to seek out professional help, and that's where we get him encountering and meeting the psychologist Dr. Lilith Ritter, who subsequently seduces and manipulates, and I would even say to a large extent, even controls Stan. It's about as textbook a noir villainous as one can conceive of outside of maybe Phyllis from Double Indemnity. Now, in the 1947 adaptation, the Doctor shows up at Stan's nightclub act. He's still performing as the Great Stanton there. She tries to trip him up with a false question about her ill mother, who actually died years earlier, but that's really the extent of her ruse. Kate Blanchett's Lilith is far more driven to pop the balloon of the Great Stanton Act. She literally snatches away the question out of Molly's hand and reads it herself, tries to test him in front of the audience. And again, here is where Stan's powers of observation, powers that we saw on display in the carnival half, such as with the Jim Beaver Marshall, come into play. But the thing with Blanchett's doctor character is she's a true vixen. She's dropping hints. She's luring Stan back to her office. And Stan, who's less and less of an angel himself, particularly in the second half of the story, as we begin greasing the wheels of his eventual downfall, he is so ego-driven that he probably can't see the irony of a man who is so skilled at observations, at making like a mentalist, but he can't see what she's doing and what is happening here. But you know what? Let's not let him off the hook. He is more than culpable. I mean, she might feed him information, but he is the agent of discord and lies here. Now, going back in time, I actually really like the actress who plays the Doctor in the 1947 version. The actress's name was Helen Walker. I believe I had only seen her in one other movie before this, and that was Call Northside 777. And I was thinking, wow, she's really good. Why didn't I see her in more things? So I did a little research, dug around, and I found out why. She had been involved in a truly horrible situation that occurred on New Year's Eve of 1946. She had picked up 3 hitchhiking World War II veterans while driving to Los Angeles, and she had a horrific accident. One of the soldiers died, the other 2 were seriously injured. She herself had a broken pelvis, and worse yet, afterwards she was brought up on charges of speeding and, driving drunk. Now, even though she was eventually acquitted, the bad PR really wrecked her career. And in all honesty, she was lucky to even get the role she did in Nightmare Alley. I mean, she did bounce around a bit after that, small roles here and there. And then, years later, her house burns down. And then a few years after that, she gets cancer and dies. At the age of 47. Oh yeah. Oh boy, step right up and Scott will give you more tragic history lessons about people you never heard of before and probably will never hear about ever again. Step right up. Now back to the 2 films. In 1947, when it's finally revealed that she's screwing with Stan, it's a mild surprise. And then the Doctor tries to gaslight him a bit before he eventually makes a run for it. Now, in the 2021 version, we know full well Kate Blanchett is up to no good. She's even got evil noir villainous hair, for God's sake. So the surprise is never that it happens. It's more about how it happens and what ultimately transpires. I mean, geez, he comes this close to actually killing her. So the Kate Blanchett version and that aspect of the storyline, I'd say it's more fun, if also more predictable. But to be clear, in matters of predictability, that is a construct of the story, be it the original novel, the 1947 version, or the 2021 version. And I am not saying that so much as a defense of the 2021 film, as an explanation of something, but I'm saying it more as an explanation of something that could be seen as an inherent flaw in all 3. Sure. But then I would press on to say that, you know what? That's kind of the nature of most film noir. Honestly, the only time, at least in my experience, that it's not ultimately predictable, or as I would actually prefer to say, inevitable, it's typically when it's made a little nicer, a little easier to deal with, a little less dark, a little more hopeful. But with noir, when it's done right, the ending is satisfying regardless of whether we knew what the destination was going to be all along. Think about it. We know William Holden is dead floating in the pool from the very start of Sunset Boulevard. We know the life insurance guy Walter Neff is almost guaranteed to die at the end of Double Indemnity. I mean, Christ, we know Guy and Bruno are going to end up going at each other at the amusement park we see early on in Strangers on a Train. These are all things you can foresee, but it's the ride to get there that makes the ending both inevitable and acceptable. Now, going back to other storylines, there is a side story that eventually leads to Ezra Grindle in the second half of the 2021 version. Actually, there's actually an exceedingly minor one in 1947 that also leads to that character. But the somewhat bigger one in the 2021 version also builds to one of those, I kind of saw that coming moments as well. And what I'm referring to is the murder-suicide perpetrated by the Mary Steenburgen character. And I'll be honest, I didn't mind it, but I did feel it was a little bit obvious, and maybe the story could have unfolded without this piece of business in the mix. You might have even saved 10 minutes by just removing it from the movie and just finessing one other aspect to get Stan to meet Grindle. As for Ezra Grindle, and by the way, it was driving me crazy, not recognizing that it was Richard Jenkins playing that role. I didn't realize that was who it was until I saw his name in the end credits. I went, oh, Richard Jenkins, y'all might remember him he's the father from 6 Feet Under, and as well as appearing in several other films. But at this point, with the Grindle stuff, this is where the film goes pretty nastily dark. Now, Grindle is this ruthless, powerful man, skeptical of anyone claiming to be a spiritualist or medium, even forcing them to take a lie detector test when meeting him, with the looming threat of a beating or probably much worse if the person should fail. We do learn he's something of a broken man ever since the loss of his beloved Dory, who died from complications of an abortion he forced her to have during their college years. So, yeah, they don't mention that part in the 1947 film. Also, in 1947, Molly, who wanted no part of any of this in any version, feels guilty from the get-go and pretty much blows up the whole charade in 1947. Yeah, it's her fault. Whereas in 2021, Grindle essentially ignores Stan and rushes to Molly posing as the dead Dory, which sadly, well, maybe sadly is not the right adverb here, but it certainly leads to Stan beating him to death. There is no such murdering done in 1947. They just run off. Stan tells Molly to go to the train station and he'll meet her there later. Well, they're on the run because, well, I guess Grindle's going to tell everyone he is a charlatan. I guess that's really the main reason. But in 2021, yeah, first he kills the dude. Then he goes all Richie Abrill on Grindle's right-hand man, Anderson, who happens to be played by Mindhunter's Holton McCallany, running him down and then running him over again. You all remember who Richie Abrill is, right? David Proval. Anyway. And then he ends up trying to strangle the so bad she's good Dr. Ritter after the money switch happens. Plus you have all those other murders that are now on his ledger. He's also been a fraud. And maybe Pete's death was a murder too. And hey, what about that fiery flashback we keep seeing that we haven't gotten the full explanation for? Although I think at this point we do, because we have discovered the truth about his father's death. But in any case, this all adds up to a guy who has a very good reason or many reasons to be on the run. I also have to mention another point must be awarded to the 2021 version, and that is about Stan Carlisle's drinking. The drinking is super significant. And yes, once we establish early on that he doesn't drink, one can say, well, that's how we know this is going to end, considering we get the origin of how Clem makes geeks in the beginning of the film as well, which is largely around finding just the right sort of drunk to fall victim to a snort or two of whiskey. But again, we see the drinking start to happen and start to increase. So when we finally get to Carlisle essentially being a hobo in 2021, it just feels far more plausible than it did in the 1947 version, where it feels like, a guy who doesn't drink any more or less than a normal person, he goes on the run, and then bang, we see him drinking around a campfire. It's also interesting to note that in the book, when he goes on the run, he does not immediately descend into becoming a completely depressed alcoholic. He actually scratches by doing tarot card readings and horoscopes until he reads in the paper that Dr. Ritter has married Ezra Grindle. And it's finding that piece of news is what sends him into an increasing spiral of being a far less functional hobo than before. And all this is what brings us to the ending. That's what we really want to talk about here anyway. And that is where the 2021 film really shines. And where the 1947 version gives in to the pressures of the studio and the times and everything else, and ends up being a little more toothless than your average hobo that wasn't named Stan Carlisle. In the 1947 version, Stan shows up during the day at a local carnival. First of all, poor choice having it be during the day. Should have been at night. So that's problem number one. He meets the guy in charge, who makes it clear he has no desire or use for anyone who's a mentalist or a magician or any act like that. Other than it being at night, that's essentially what happens in the 2021 version as well. Also in the 2021 version, Stan actually recognizes things from the earlier incarnation of the very same carnival. We see that pickled baby with the third eye and the radio that he had sold Clem for $5. But back to 47. After a snort or two of whiskey, it's clear that the guy in charge only has one possible job for Stan, and that's to be the new geek. But as people in his position always do, he promises it'll just be temporary, although we know that it never is. It should also at this point be noted that a few times during the later scenes in the second half of the film, when Stan takes a drink or he smells alcohol, we actually hear on the soundtrack the screaming of the geek that we heard at the very beginning of the film. So they are really telegraphing the ending something fierce in the 1947 version. Now, they don't go that far in the 2021 version. Oh, by the way, did I mention? I didn't. The guy who's that ferocious geek in the beginning of this version, that's the actor who plays Arthur Shelby on Peaky Blinders. Actor's name is Paul Anderson, not to be confused with either Paul T. Anderson or Paul Thomas Anderson, who y'all know I mentioned earlier. Now, anyway, if the 1947 version had ended, I don't know, maybe if it ended on a close-up of Powers realizing what his life had become, and when he gives that line, that's what I was made for, and all of a sudden, you fade black, the end. Oh man, it would be such a much stronger film as a result of that. But instead, we get this next day or later that night bit tacked on, kind of where he's apparently gone off the deep end and he's on loose. And the other carnies are trying to corral him with a straitjacket or something. And we see that this is the carnival where Molly is. She realizes that the geek, it's Stan. They end up in each other's arms, so we get a hopeful ending. Ah, look how far he fell. But eventually he fell back into her arms. There is no such ending in the book. And there is certainly no such ending in the 2021 film either. In fact, one could say the final scene may very well be the strongest scene in the entire film. Tim Blake Nelson shows up as the new guy running the operation. And as almost always, he's great. But as he begins his spiel about the geek job, we are instantly thinking of what Defoe's Clem had said almost, 2.5 hours earlier in the film? But now every word that Tim Blake Nelson's character delivers has the additional weight and air of inevitable horror. And finally, it all rests on that final shot of Bradley Cooper. He's lost everything. He can only now embrace his own insanity, his desperation, his finding yet a new level of hell to drop down the downward spiral to. And he cries and almost maniacally laughs at the same time that it's the job he was made for. Cut to black, and that is the end that I will say probably saves the movie for me. Because, look, when you're dealing with a Guillermo Del Toro film, you can automatically check off the boxes for set design, art direction, cinematography, hell, even costume design. Because they are all going to be as good as it gets. And this film is gorgeous to look at. I mean, the carnival attractions, the Art Deco corridors, the interior spaces, they're all exquisite. And it's really hard to find any fault with the performances. You know, one could say maybe Blanchett vamps it up a bit much as the femme fatale, but no, it felt so right. It was, perfect for that character. I mean, Toni Collette and especially Strahan are perfect in their roles. The supporting players like Jenkins and Perlman, they're all fine performances. So who do we have left? We have Mara and Cooper. Thing is, Rooney Mara's part, Molly, let's be honest, it's the role in the film that's a little bit on the thankless side. It just is. So I will give her as much credit as possible. I think she does as much as she can with a part like that. It's not for want of screen time. It's just the nature of that role. And maybe there's a bit more to it than there was in the 1947 version. But I don't know if there was substantially more to it. Which then, everything else is resting on the shoulders of Bradley Cooper. And it's interesting because I feel for that Stan Carlisle character to work from the get-go, we have to see him as a blank slate. There has to be a sense of mystery there, but as well as being something of a cipher. At least at first. I'm trying to think of an example of that. Think about maybe, if you've seen it, Lee Pace's Joe character in the first season of *Halt and Catch Fire*. It's kind of like something along those lines. That either makes sense or not, depending on what you've watched in your life, I guess. Now, this role, is this Cooper's best dramatic performance? No, it's not. That would still, without question, be A Star Is Born. He was unbelievable in that. But he's still pretty damn good here, especially, again, as the film draws to a painful, powerful close. Is it on the same level as, I don't know, Silver Linings Playbook or American Hustle, perhaps? It might actually... Those roles might be a bit more fun, although there's a bit more pathos to Silver Linings Playbook, perhaps. Overall, this role might have a bit more weight. He's also going... This is about as dark as he has gone, but that could be said of most actors. They don't tend to take a role that, kind of drifts to the darkness and still be a lead like this one. So I think it worked. But one can't imagine if Leonardo DiCaprio had taken the role, because that was what was originally planned. How would he have done it? And I'll be honest, I think he actually would have nailed it. And I am not the biggest Leo fan either. Oh yeah, Departed, that reimagining. Anyway, never mind. At the end of the day, I think the way I've been referring to the movie is I might have admired the film more than I liked it. I do applaud making it in the first place because there are so many reasons why a studio wouldn't want to touch something like this. It also has the seeming rarity of a movie with a mid-range budget. Because movies like that being made nowadays, it seems fleeting and rare. And I know, I just essentially said a $60 million movie is mid-range. But it often feels nowadays like most movies are either made for under 10 million or over 100 million. It's just the nature of the business. So, if I'm awarding stars like on a 5-star scale, where do I go higher with, or do I make them the same? I don't feel like I can make them the same because I've said all that about the art direction and technical aspects that are just amazing about the 2021 movie. And then you get those really solid backstories and character developments that the earlier film lacks. Not to mention a better ending. Yeah, it's tough. It just feels like more than just a half star should separate these two. But there's no way I can give the 47 version less than 3 stars. It's definitely a good movie. But giving the 2021 film 4 stars also feels like too much. No one cares. You know what? It doesn't matter. I'm going to switch the scales to numbers. I'll do 1 to 10. So 1 to 10. Okay, so 1947 version, you get a 6. 2021 version, I guess then you get a 7. There you go. Okay. I am now officially tired of hearing me talk, but hopefully you enjoyed it. And if that's true, then you will really enjoy hanging out on our Facebook page. Find us at the Serious TV Drama Podcast page. Hit like, and you will have joined the group. You lucky devil, you. You can also find our podcast most places that have such things available, like the infamous Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or better still, just go to stvdpodcast.podbean.com for all, like this number, 333 of our recordings. Never forget you can follow us on Instagram at Serious TV Drama. And better still, you can also follow us. Actually, it's not better still. We need more Instagram followers than we need Twitter followers right now. Where are they? Anyway, you can also follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is at STVD Podcast. STVD as in Serious TV Drama. As for what is next in the pipeline, so to speak, depending on the schedules, I would say in about a week's time, we're going to see if Brian and I can knock out a podcast covering the next 2 Peacemaker episodes, which would be the one that's already aired this last week, the 6th episode, as well as the upcoming 7th episode. So we can talk about those 2 and then maybe try to speculate about the final episode of the season. I think that's what we're going to do. Beyond that, there could be something else coming in February. I don't know if Dan and I are going to lay low till March as far as getting into breaking ground on season 5 of Breaking Bad. And then, of course, if we're talking about March, we do have that Batman movie that's coming out in the first week. We'll see. I don't know. Until one of those podcasts happen, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. And before you tuck yourself in tonight, double lock those doors so you don't go sleepwalking down Nightmare Alley.